Don't hesitate.
All right, well, today we are dealing with Australia and Massacre on the frontiers of colonialism in Australia. And just the very first thing I'd like to mention is a statistic. In 1788, when the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay and went on to found a convict penal station in Australia, the estimated Aboriginal population of the entire Australian continent and the island of Tasmania was about 1 million. I stress that these are estimates, nobody knows very well, but this is the best estimate, 1 million. In 1911, shortly after Australia became a unified nation state, the Aboriginal population of the entire continent was 31,000. This represents a 97% attrition rate. I think in any sort of, well, objective summary, this looks a lot like genocide, where 97% of a population dies off by design or accident. These are terrible figures to contemplate. How can 97% of the indigenous people of a continent die off? And of course, this is a central question in Australian history, and it's a question that is at the heart of the historiographical debate in Australian history that some people call the history wars. It's not just a debate about historiography, though. It's a debate, as it were, for the soul of Australia. It's about what Australia stands for, what it is. Is it, a fair young land of promise and fairness, or is it a genocidal state? And this has divided the Australian nation, I suppose. Those who oppose the view that the history of Australia is sort of genocidal, that the Australian Aborigines were mainly done in by massacre, disease, and deliberate racist policies designed to separate children from their parents. Those who would contest this view of history, they call this bleak view of history the black armband view of history. And it seems to be a view of history, this anti-black armband view of history that is associated largely with the right wing in Australia, conservative politicians. A number of Australian prime ministers in recent years have actually come out against this black armband view of history. But Australia is blessed with many, many historians, many more historians than we seem to have in South Africa. I'm not quite sure why Australia has such a robust historical tradition. And I'm here to tell you that the majority of Australian historians are researching the crimes of the Australian past. They support and endorse the view that Aborigines were massacred, that genocide was a deliberate policy, and terrible atrocities were perpetrated on the Australian Aborigines. And needless to say, the work that I'm going to be talking about here mostly today is of this school of thought that believes that there was a war waged by white settlers against the Aboriginal Australians. One of the foremost historians who's done research into massacre and the eradication of Australian Aborigines is one of my colleagues working on this book with me, Lyndall Ryan. I've already mentioned her massacre map, which you can access online, which shows all the massacres that have come to light, which have involved Australian Aborigines. And she is also a foremost authority on Tasmania. So in the lecture that follows, although I'm giving some attention to the Australian colony of New South Wales, I think I'm going to speak largely about Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land as it was called until it had a name change in an attempt to wipe out some of its terrible past. And perhaps the reason I'm interested in Tasmania as well, thanks very much. Thank you. The reason I'm interested in Tasmania is that I had a sabbatical there once and was terribly interested and involved in the history. As you know, it was a penal colony, as well as being the site of one of the most notorious, earliest examples of genocide in history. Well, this is the way historians put it. I mean, the Tasmanian Aboriginal population was virtually annihilated, wiped off the face of the earth between 1803, when Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land, was settled by a British penal colony, and as early as 1835, the writing was already on the wall for the Tasmanian Aboriginal population. So within about 3 or 4 decades, people were already anticipating the extinction of the Aboriginal Tasmanians. And the British authorities by 1835 were saying, this is absolutely shocking and scandalous, and unless we do something to prevent this, this will be a, quote, indelible stain on the British nation. Well, it remains an indelible stain, but just not to preempt my conclusion, but just to make the point that there are today many people who claim to be Australian Tasmanian Aborigines. Many Tasmanians today claim Aboriginal descent, and they were particularly incensed, were these descendants of Tasmanian Aborigines, by a film which came out, I think it was in the 1970s, called The Last Tasmanian, which suggested that they had all been wiped out. In actual fact, people claiming Tasmanian Aboriginal descent have survived. Many of them were incorporated as servants, orphaned children into settler families. Many were kidnapped by bush rangers and sealers. Many women were abducted to become concubines or wives, and their descendants proved actually more hardy than, I suppose, the prophets of doom supposed. And there are today Tasmanian Aborigines who are proud of their heritage, who claim that descent, and who would refute the idea that they were completely eradicated. But nonetheless, it's true to say that their culture and language was eradicated. So let me, after these introductory remarks, let me proceed. Australia is linked to the history of the revolutionary period in a number of ways. Perhaps the first one is that, as you know, Australia began its life as a settler colony, as a convict colony. And the convicts who arrived in Australia on the first fleet in 1788 did so because the ability for Britain to deposit its convicts in America had come to an end with the American War of Independence. For some reason, the independent United States of America no longer wanted to accept British convicts. Until 1775, some 200,000 British felons had been dumped in America. And this is an extraordinary fact for us to think about. Nobody talks about America as being a nation of convicts or a nation descended from convicts, but actually 200,000 of them were. And about 2,000 British criminals per annum had been sent to America before 1775. These British criminals, many of them were characterized as being indentured servants. They were forced to labor for a certain number of years for their masters or owners in America. And this is exactly what happened later on in Australia. So we have indentured labor, convicts being sent to these settlements. But America is shut off to these to the British punitive system in 1775. For a few years, Britain's surplus criminals are stored in prison hulks on the River Thames. Prisons are overflowing with these individuals. It's estimated that in 1775, there were some 30,000 people a year in Britain being sentenced to prison sentences, and many of these people were actually being sentenced to death. But as a form of leniency, the death sentence was suspended and they were transported. But how do you deal with 30,000 convicts a year unless you have a place to put them? So this is an age of penal reform and experiments with convict systems. Half of the history of Australia is, I suppose, its convict history. The other half is its Aboriginal history. We're focusing here on the Aboriginal history. But just to say, the origins of the settlement, as you all know, was that Australia was chosen, or New South Wales was chosen as a destination for convicts in the future. There's another linkage to the revolutionary period and the Enlightenment that Australia has, and that is that Australia was actually, as it were, discovered by European explorers and mariners in the 18th century. I'm saying people like Captain Cook and Baudin were sailing around the coast of Australia. The European discovery of Australia goes back a lot earlier to the Dutch. Once upon a time it was called New Holland. The VOC, having a base in Batavia, was no stranger to the west coast of Australia. But what I want to say is that Enlightenment, scientific exploration and research brought Australia into the headlights of European colonial expansion. European colonial powers expanding into the Indian Ocean and the Pacific were aware of Australia, aware of its potential, and in this sense Australia became this competition, this area of competitiveness between the British and the French empires. To an extent, New South Wales was seized and colonised by the British to prevent the French from getting there, and so was Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania, which until about 1802, 1803, people weren't even clear that it was a separate island. They still thought it was linked to the Australian mainland, as it was in fact about 12,000 years before present. 12,000 years before present, you could walk from Tasmania to mainland Australia, but that was in the last ice age. Once the seas melted, the island was isolated and the community in Tasmania became distinct to some extent. The other way in which Australia is linked to this Enlightenment revolutionary project is through the ideas of philosophers or philosophes, once again about the noble savage or savagery, about and about ideas of land ownership and land possession. As you probably know, notoriously, the Australian Aborigines were judged to be savages, barbarians of the very lowest order, perhaps only slightly superior to the South African Khoi in the table of hierarchy of savageness in the Enlightenment discourse. And the Australian Aborigines were hunter-gatherers, and as a result, this legitimised, in the eyes of the British, their occupation of large chunks of Australia on the grounds that the Aborigines didn't improve, farm, or cultivate the land, that they were, in a sense, not worthy of the land because they were not improving it. They were, in a sense, part of nature rather than part of humanity, in that they lived in unimproved landscape. And this false perception of what Australian Aborigines, the relationship of Australian Aborigines to the land, this false perception enabled the British to declare the concept of terra nullius, that Australia belonged to nobody, to no man. The Australian Aborigines did not possess the land. They didn't own the land. They had no sovereignty of the land. It was terra nullius. So the British claimed the land by virtue of discovery. It belonged to nobody, so they were there first, so it belonged to them. Of course, this is a very dubious legal argument. Lots of people had to bend over backwards to actually try and square this circle. But it goes back to the ideas of John Locke. Basically, John Locke will pitch up again in the American case. And Locke, a very respected political theorist, proclaimed that if the land was not improved by agriculture, if nobody was actually working the land, then it by right should belong to the people who improved and worked it. And this was the idea that enabled people like Captain Cook, basically before even 1788, to declare that the land belonged to Britain. He also declared that, well, retrospectively the British declared, because the Aboriginals did not resist Captain Cook's proclamation vigorously enough, it showed that they were actually in favour of it. Well, this picture sort of almost gives it away. There you see Aboriginals on the shoreline shouting and shaking spears at Captain Cook, and it's, by all interpretations, they're saying, you know, basically, and Australians are used to this sort of language, so forgive me. Yeah, they're probably saying bugger off to Captain Cook, but he was treating this as a warm welcome, well, if you believe it. Anyway, the first fleet arrives in 1788, and so New South Wales is the first area where the Aboriginals have to face the fact of British occupation, British infiltration, as you might put it. Australian Aborigines have probably been in Australia since at least 45,000 years before present. Australian archaeologists keep pushing the date back a bit further, 50,000 years, 60,000 years, 70,000 years. But the Australian Aborigines are basically Homo sapiens. They couldn't have got to Australia before Homo sapiens evolved in Africa. Although Australian Aborigines do like to think that they were, you know, basically always there, that they came out of the earth in the dream time, and they were always in Australia. However we interpret this, the facts, they were there for thousands and thousands of years. And what is more, they were not people who did not improve or, in a sense, farm the land. They, modern ecologists and environmentalists suggest that the Australian Aborigines used fire farming. They used to have and this is something which perhaps modern Australians can learn from the Aboriginals. Controlled burning of bushes was something which the Aborigines had perfected over thousands of years. They were never without a fire stick, were the Aborigines. Some people claim this is because they couldn't actually make fire. They had to carry smouldering logs around with them all the time. That's not the case. They knew how to make fire. Even the Aboriginals in Tasmania, cut off for 12,000 years. People like Jared Diemen says that they had forgotten how to make fire. That's not true. They could make fire, and they carried fire sticks because it was part of their, as it were, toolkit, their technology. And what they did was they would burn patches of scrub to improve the pasture, to attract the kangaroos so that they could hunt, spear, and eat the kangaroos. So in a sense, although they are hunter-gatherers, they are managing their landscape through fire, through controlled hunting. So they're certainly not, this isn't terra nullius. There are hundreds of different Australian Aboriginal languages and clans. They each had a very strong sense of territoriality. If one group trespassed into another group's territory, that would be trouble. So certainly the idea that they didn't have land ownership is false. And of course, as you know, Australians, Aborigines linked places on Earth to this supernatural state called the dream time, through songlines, through myths, through stories, through traditions. So there was a sacred landscape above which the landscape on earth shadowed or represented. And all in all, this gave them a very deep relationship with the land. So when the first cargo of convicts arrived, under the control of a man called Philip, was his surname, Philip's instructions were to treat the Aborigines amicably and to try and get on with them, not to cause them any offence, but to try and negotiate a sort of a modus vivendi with them so that there was limited friction, but there was no attempt really to buy territory from them, to barter territory from them. The idea was that you didn't need to do that, you just needed to pitch up and be kind, and you could gradually work your will on these people. There were about 1,000 convicts who arrived, well, about 1,000 people arrived in the first fleet, 580 male convicts, 150 Marines, 20 officers, 80 Royal Navy personnel, and 200 women. These were mostly female convicts between the age of 18 and 24. So these are nubile women who are obviously brought there for the purpose of procreation. So this was going to be a permanent settlement. The idea was to multiply, and the shortage in women was, the idea was that it would be made up from local Aboriginal women or Pacific Islanders in the long run. But right from the start, as it were, this shortage of women, and I speak of a relative shortage of women given the numbers of the men involved here, the shortage of women is going to cause conflict between these convict settlers, their guards, and the Aborigines. And indeed, down through the ages, most conflicts between white settlers and Aborigines are going to be about resources, mainly land, and women. Fights over resources and women are going to be a very prominent cause of distress. It's ironic, of course, that the very first settler colony in Australia was a penal colony. For Christopher Bailey, who's the man who wrote Imperial Meridian and focuses on the nature of the Second British Empire, for him this is a perfect example, quote, of the new imperial despotism in miniature. In other words, nothing could better represent the nature of the Second British Empire than a penal colony for Christopher Bailey. And various Australian writers have played with this idea, that Australia was a concentration camp founded upon genocide. This is an unkind view, of course. This is a black armband view of Australian history. But this is the reality. You're putting convicts down amongst the Aborigines. What do you think is going to happen? How are you going to keep control? Well, British policy towards the Aborigines to begin with, Lyndall Ryan suggests that we can just determine four. Let me just show you some pictures, these lovely paintings by Joseph Lycett, who was actually a convict, who was convicted to be transported to Australia for forgery. So he put his skills of artistry to use in doing these beautiful paintings, which were painted actually near the town of what is now Newcastle on the Hunter River, which is north of Sydney by about 2 or 3 hours by train, if the train's working properly. So these are pictures that Lycett did of these Aborigines along the Hunter River near Newcastle, which was in many respects better provisioned, a nicer part of the world than Sydney, had a bigger Aboriginal population. He's one of the few Europeans who was able to see one of the corroboree, or great gatherings of Australian Aborigines. Frequently, this would involve the meeting of different groups. There would be much partying and dancing. Typically, they took place around the time of full moon, and this is one of the very few pictures we have. Once again, Lycett was, I suppose, intimate enough, close enough to these people to observe a funeral. You can notice that the figures here, some of them have got white spots painted on them. This isn't smallpox, which will shortly break out amongst them. This is some sort of decoration they used when they were in mourning. And then just to show you that the Australian Aboriginal reception of Europeans was not always naive and friendly. Right from the start, it involved a degree of hostility and attempting to get these people to move on, to move away. Anyway, the first, let me get back to Lyndall Ryan's 4 phases of settler Aboriginal relationship. The first phase she refers to as the phase of conciliation, which takes place between about 1788 and 1792. And this is associated with the policy of Arthur Phillip, who was instructed to be conciliatory. And he tried to befriend the Aboriginals around the Sydney area. He took certain Aboriginals into his own household, tried to bring them up. He even took some to England, trying to teach them the language and English ways. But this conciliatory attempt would often break down over convict men escaping, getting in amongst the Aboriginals, abducting their wives, raping their wives, stealing, etc., etc. They would be killed. There would be counter expeditions mounted by Phillips and his men to teach the Aboriginals a lesson. At one stage, Philip lost his temper and said, let's go and catch these people and actually behead them. Luckily, he didn't catch them. And he is an interesting figure, Arthur Phillip. There's a lovely book written by Inga Clendining called Dancing with Strangers, where she describes one of these first encounters between Phillips and an Aboriginal man. And the Aborigines had a tradition of spearing people. It's like I suppose like a form of a robust sport, a robust form of retribution and revenge. If you've done something wrong, if you've offended somebody or somebody's group, you have to let them throw a certain number of spears at you. And you're allowed to dodge and duck and weave and dive. And usually it's not fatal. And if you get wounded, that's a good thing, because now your blood has been spilt and retribution and forgiveness can take place. And Philip was actually speared through the arm by one of the Aborigines he had taken captive at some stage or brought into his household. And to his credit, Philip didn't respond with violence and extermination, and a good relationship was established thereafter. But this is a unique period at the beginning of settler settlement in Australia. The next phase in relationships between the Aborigines and the settlers began in 1793, and Lyndall Ryan calls this the policy of distance and fear. And here the policy is to repel Aborigines from centres of European concentration and place them on the outside of the colonial legal system. So in other words, you've tried to integrate Aborigines, you've tried to make them English, you've tried to show them the benefits of civilization. They're still fighting you, wanting you to go. So now you keep them at their distance. You don't incorporate them into your own legal system. You don't think that you don't give them the rights of British subjects at all. They have no rights, and you treat with them in a distant and wary fashion. This policy of distance and fear was replaced in 1811 and 1821 according to Lyndall Ryan, by a policy of outright conquest. So you go from conciliation to keep your distance to now I'm going to conquer you and show you who's boss. And during this period, 1811 to 1821, many Aborigines were attacked by military forces, taught lessons in the language of the day, killed in retributive raids, and their children were brought violently under control by being forcibly adopted by British families as servants. And this, then, the policy is then escalated to stage 4, according to Lyndall Ryan, 1822 to 1830, a policy of extermination and removal, in which British governors drew on their experience in the recent Napoleonic Wars, together with an increase in their military resources, to try and impose martial law on the Aborigines, to drive them out of the land wanted by settlers, and to exterminate those who resisted or to remove them. So there's a fairly rapid escalation from 1788 to conciliation and 1830 to extermination and forced removal. But throughout all of these 4 phases, there is never any acknowledgement of Aboriginal sovereignty or Aboriginal land ownership or Aboriginal land rights. Let's just go back to this map of New South Wales and look in more detail at the period of between the 1788 and 1792 so-called policy of reconciliation. Even during this period, and the area that we're dealing with here is around present-day Sydney, and the group we are dealing with was called the Eora, E-O-R-A. Even during this period of conciliation, deaths were occurring in fights with Aboriginals, between Aboriginals and convicts, mostly over sex. And then, to the great disadvantage of Aborigines, smallpox attacked this settlement and the surrounding Aborigines in April 1789. Hardly any Europeans were affected by this disease. They all had immunity, but it killed about half of the Eora. And Australian historians today are debating whether or not the smallpox was deliberately introduced. There is evidence both ways. We know that the deliberate use of smallpox to thin the ranks of North American Indians was used by the British in the 1760s. They used to distribute infected blankets and gifts to the Indians to deliberately kill them. And we do know that some of the personnel who was involved in this atrocity in 1760s America happened to pop up at Botany Bay at the same time, and that amongst the doctors' sort of specimen bottles, they had samples of the smallpox disease. Whether this was deliberately introduced or not, well, there's a lot of writing about this. I'm not going to take a side, but we should note also the devastating effect smallpox had on the Khoi Khoi of the Cape in 1730. So smallpox assists the British project of settlement and colonization. Whether it was deliberately introduced or not, we don't know, but certainly it has a devastating effect. By the next stage, distance and fear in this particular part of the world, the stage of distance and fear between 1793 and 1810, this is a period when Britain is now at war with revolutionary France. It sends reinforcements to Australia to prevent a French takeover of Australia. It annexes or occupies Van Diemen's land in 1803 to preempt the French from getting there. And the settlement spreads northwards to the Hawkesbury River, which is just north of Sydney, which is a beautiful river, which was a favourite area for Aboriginal societies, and freed convict settlers were encouraged to start farming along this river. Of course, once they began to do this, it provoked determined Aboriginal response. The settlers introduced livestock, which destroyed the routes which the Aborigines used. They took over certain areas of where freshwater mussels were a food source, and generally they were taking over the land and interfering with the kangaroo hunting that was going on. Because the settlers' idea was that if you've got cattle and sheep, they must take precedent over kangaroos and possums and what have you, and they kept the Aborigines away from their farms. Some of the settlers attempted to make friends with the Aborigines by giving them gifts of bread, gifts of potatoes, gifts of sugar, and right-wing historians like Keith Windschuttle, who's sort of the leading anti-black armband school of history historians, Windschuttle believes that the Aborigines became hopelessly addicted to sugar and tea, and this provoked them into continuous attacks against white settlers, and basically if they got shot by trying to steal sugar and tea, then it was their own fault. The truth is more complicated. Aboriginals did tend to try and steal food resources from the settlers. They did tend to regard any crops the settlers grew as being common property. They did dig up potatoes and strip ears of wheat, etc., etc. But this isn't just out of sheer avarice and greed. It is a form of resistance and targeted destruction. And in order to prevent this, I suppose the British sent troops to the region. They form a new organisation called the New South Wales Corps. Many of these, the New South Wales Corps are, of course, people hardened in the Napoleonic War. They include a smattering of ex-convicts and settlers. And now massacres proper rarely begin. The New South Wales Corps feels it has the right to shoot any Aboriginal who's guilty of theft, trespass, or aggressive behaviour. And the settlers too believe they have a license to kill Aborigines who are resisting their presence on the land. Significantly, no settlers or no members of the New South Wales Corps are ever convicted of murder for the crimes which they might have committed. Hardly any colonists were ever sentenced for killing an Aborigine. Some of them were reprimanded, some of them were suspended briefly, but this is the beginning of the feeling that you can kill Aborigines and get away with it as long as you feel you have a justification. Aborigines, on the other hand, who might kill or rob a settler are usually killed out of hand, although some were imprisoned or deported. There was a sense among some of the British governors that you are dealing with as it were, warriors or soldiers who are entitled to some sort of, that you shouldn't be treating them as murderers, you can treat them as almost prisoners of war and deport them. Anyway, this stage of affairs centred around the Hawkesbury River and this period of distance and fear. We can also think to ourselves in 1803, Tasmania is, or Van Diemen's Land is occupied by the British. This is a period of British colonial expansion, but this really takes off stage 4, 1810 to 1821, period of conquest, when a new governor in Australia, Lachlan Macquarie, governor of New South Wales in 1810, regards Aborigines who resist now as insurgents, initiates military campaigns against them, attacks groups on the outskirts of Sydney, in 1814 and 1806, in Tasmania in 1817, advocates massacre as a part of the policy of dealing with this resistance, and denies the Aborigines ever the chance to become subjects, and denies them their land rights, denies them legal rights. Those who happened to be caught resisting, some of them were put into camps on the outskirts of the town, given tokens to show their surrendered subject status, which was similar to South Africa and North America, where certain Khoi chiefs and Indian chiefs were given tokens to show they accepted British authority. And increasingly, numbers of Aboriginal children are entering the local settler households as servants. Finally, the period of extermination and removal, 1822 to 1830, the British government in New South Wales encourages settlers now to move over the Blue Ridge Mountains into an area called Bathurst. There's a Bathurst in the Eastern Cape, which dates to about the same time. Bathurst was the colonial secretary, or the secretary for colonies in Britain. And after the settlers moved over the Blue Ridge Mountains into the Bathurst Plains, this is the beginning of the pastoralist frontier proper in Australia, or the pastoralist invasion of Australia. And it's largely led by veterans of the Peninsular War, people, disbanded soldiers who've been promised land in Australia, provided they farm productively, and sheep seems to be the new way, and the gorgeous grazing lands on the other side of the Blue Ridge Mountains beckon them, and this sparks off basically the virtual extermination of the Aborigines who dwelt in the Bathurst Plains, and also it will spark off the virtual extermination of Aborigines who live in Tasmania, because this is the same thing is happening in Tasmania at this time after 1822. The Napoleonic Wars are over. British settlers are being resettled now in colonies. Think of the 1820 settlers in the Cape, 1822 settlers in Tasmania, same and over the Blue Ridge Mountains. And these are settlers devoted to pastoral expansion, and the victims of this are the Aborigines. By 1830, as I've said, this process is so far advanced that the British government realised the Aborigines in these three areas of, around Sydney, in the Bathurst Plains area and Tasmania, are on the verge of extinction. And Lord Bathurst writes to Governor Ralph Darling at this stage in 1830 that the adoption of any line of conduct having for its avowed or for its secret object the extinction of the native race could not fail to leave an indelible stain upon the character of the British government. It's interesting that he acknowledges that there is an avowed and a secret object that is going on, because some of these actions of extermination against the Australian Aborigines are carried out by the New South Wales Corps with the approval of the government, but the great majority of them are carried out by ordinary settlers, I suppose the equivalent of the commando system in the Cape, who secretly, without advertising it too much, go about the daily business of massacring and killing Aborigines because they get in the way. By the time that Bathurst was complaining about this in 1830, the total combined population of both the colonies of New South Wales and Tasmania was now about 80,000. The total combined population of the colonists was about 80,000, while there were only about 500 Aborigines left in New South Wales and 300 in Tasmania. The Aborigines were now considered to be immaterial to the colonial life, and in Tasmania, settlers are already beginning to write narratives and explanations which anticipated the extinction of the Tasmanians and tried to explain this either in terms of their susceptibility to European diseases, their propensity to drunkenness and drink, or basically that they were fated to perish through some sort of Darwinian natural selection process. These three regions that we're talking about, which are now so reduced in numbers, had once housed 16 distinct Aboriginal nations with a combined population of about 20,000. So New South Wales and Tasmania and the Hunter Valley, about 20,000 Aboriginals in all in 1788, and now a few hundred in each case. So let's move back on. Just to say a bit more specifically about Tasmania, which has attracted a lot of attention because the impact of the devastating policies of massacre and colonial settlement are most obvious in Tasmania because it's a smaller space. By the way, Tasmania is about the same size as Ireland or Sri Lanka, if you want to put it in terms that you might grasp. It's not that small, but with only 10,000 Aborigines to begin with, you could see the impact on their population very dramatically, perhaps more so than in New South Wales. But the point to make is that New South Wales, the impact on Aborigines was equally devastating. Once again, you have this sort of favoured view that Captain Cook was a welcome arrival when he landed in Adventure Bay in Tasmania in 1777. You can sort of just look at that map while I make some progress with talking about Tasmania. In 1803, it was opened to European settlement, and once again the idea was that it would be a settlement primarily of convicts. The settlement in Tasmania started off in 1804 with a massacre in Risdon Cove, which is just across the Derwent estuary from Hobart, when a group of convict soldiers and would-be settlers in Risdon Cove were suddenly alarmed or frightened by a large group of what they thought were warlike Aborigines approaching them. It seems that these Aborigines were rarely on one of their seasonal hunting routes on the way to hunt kangaroo, but the British soldiers fired at them without any provocation, fired grape-shot cannon musketry at this group of Aborigines, and then lied about the consequences. But it's estimated that some 60 to 70 Aborigines were killed in this almost first encounter between settlers and colonists. Thereafter, the extent of European penetration or presence on the land was quite limited. Most of the European settlement in Tasmania took place up this central valley, because the west part of the island is mainly temperate rainforest or eucalyptus forest. It's a beautiful part of the world, Tasmania. About a third of it is sort of a World Heritage forestry site. A third is perhaps given over to eucalyptus forestry, and about a third to agriculture. But the European presence was initially quite slow, and the first convicts were of humble origin and descent, and many of them were not given large farms to begin with, and they mingled quite intimately with the Aboriginals. Many of the convicts actually ran away, and in Australian parlance they became known as bush rangers. They took Aboriginal wives. They lived the life of sort of bandits and hunters on the margins of polite society. And you got quite a sort of a multicultural society formed mainly of convicts drawn from Scotland and Ireland, who, one historian, Boyce, argues that these are people who are themselves coming from sort of hunting, fishing, communities who are not that dissimilar to the Aborigines, and their impact on the landscape is not as severe as the pastoralists who would follow them in the 1820s. Around the fringes of the island, you also have this interesting set of people, we call them sealers or whalers. These are quite ecologically quite frightening people, because their job is to kill seals and kill whales and move where the seals and whales are. And the offshore islands of Tasmania were rich in these marine resources, and the sealers and whalers would often kidnap Aboriginal women to force them to be their wives or concubines. Some historians say that these women went willingly. Sometimes they were exchanged for dogs. The Aboriginals rarely valued European hunting dogs, and European hunting dogs made a huge impact on the wildlife of the island. Aborigines really valued these dogs, and sometimes there are records of men exchanging their women for dogs. But that doesn't, I suppose, take away the fact that many of these women were raped, subject to forced sex. But it's the descendants of these sealers and whalers today who form the backbone of the Aboriginal community. Anyway, let me just show you that Hobart was established in 1804, and Tasmania is about 43 degrees south. It's temperate in its climate, perhaps the most like Britain of any part of Australia. And very quickly, its agricultural potential became evident, and it became sort of the breadbasket of Australia. And later on, would become would have actually more sheep than New South Wales. It was really a sort of a little gem of an island, and of course, this attracted settlers in their droves. So. Once the settlers began arriving in big numbers, as they did after 1820, the early, almost intimate relations between small-scale convict settlers, small-scale sealers and whalers, naturally there was conflict between these groups and the Aboriginals, but it was as nothing compared to the later opposition that was sparked by the arrival of the pastoralist frontier, when sort of gentlemen farmers, officers from the Napoleonic Wars, people of capital are granted farms. You're granted a farm provided you have the capital to farm it, and you're granted convict labourers to help you farm your farm. And there's a very rapid expansion up the Central Valley of Tasmania into the territory of various groups, which provokes massive retaliation and a full-scale guerrilla war. In Australian history, this guerrilla war launched by the Tasmanian Aborigines is called the Black War, and the Tasmanians proved to be very effective guerrilla fighters. They managed to kill some 201 settlers during the course of the Black War, which is quite an achievement. But they themselves suffered at least 878 casualties. So they paid a high price for this very effective resistance. And the war took the form mainly of the government, yes, sending troops to protect the new settlers, sending troops on punitive raids against Aboriginal resistors, but it also took the form of the settlers themselves being licensed to kill, exterminate, or shoot any Aboriginal who might offer resistance. The usual form of Aboriginal resistance was to attack the stockmen and their shepherds, or to attack the stockmen's houses. And this is exactly the same as in the Cape at this time, when the San are trying to fight the Trek Boers. They target the shepherds, they target the sheep and cattle, they target the homesteads of these isolated farmers. They don't try and take on the military, they don't try and march into Hobart and destroy the centre of settlement. They fight